Well, the first thing I wanted to do was just tell the story of the last few decades in UK politics and talk about how we got to this point, but I'm going to postpone that because I think there's some important points of confusion and some sort of obvious arguments that aren't really being made by the political class that I've heard. It seems like there are people talking on two different levels about some of these things. I believe it was ITV that started this, and it quickly was adopted by Channel 4 and has now migrated over to CNN and Christiane Amanpour, who should be ashamed of herself. They know that there was no Brexit government installed. They know that immigration policy is going to be decided by future governments, that the whole point was to repatriate powers of future governments to decide, not to dictate to the current government anything other than beginning the process to leave, which takes at least 2 years from when Article 50 is invoked. David Cameron did say he was going to do that immediately, but he does have a good point that he should not try to bind or limit the future government and its ability to negotiate. I think he should have, well, I understand why he didn't. If he had said that he would leave office if the vote didn't go the way he wanted it to, I think the Labour heartlands would have voted even more strongly for leave. And I think it would have been 55 to 57% voting to leave instead of 52%. But anyway, it would have been right to more clearly explain to people that there would be a new government, or at least there's potentially be a new government, and that it was possible that Article 50 could be delayed. But if anything, I blame the Prime Minister for not explaining that. I don't blame Leave, which never made any claims that it was going to have some hostile takeover of the government immediately, or that it had any ability to do so when it only had about 100 or so members of parliament that agreed with it. That argument was not made, and it wouldn't have made any sense to make that argument. And then they show a handful of people that they talked to that talked about cutting off immigration immediately and cutting off Muslim immigration. But people misunderstanding the issue does not mean that the Leave campaign misled anyone. There are people that misunderstand any election that takes place ever on any side. I'm sure there are a bunch of stupid reasons people voted the way they voted in the last election. There are a bunch of stupid reasons people voted Remain in this election. People thought all kinds of crazy things were going to happen and voted Remain because of the crazy things that they thought would happen. If we took out people that thought all these crazy things would happen, we would be taking more people out of the Remain vote than we would out of the Leave vote. And again, with perfect knowledge of what the Leave vote would cause, there's a lot of people that would have voted Leave just to get David Cameron out of office and to be an embarrassment to the current Conservative Party leadership. So I don't accept any of these arguments at all, and they're complete nonsense. I didn't watch the Thunderfoot video, but I did see a couple of clips. And again, he has to know that this is not intellectually sound or valid at all, what he did. He showed a Nigel Farage clip talking about the net figure being about $10 billion a year, that figure in the future can be used toward schools, doctors, and housing, which it can be. But as long as the money's still going to the European Union, that money can't be used differently. So the whole point was to use the money differently, not that all of a sudden the government was going to pull an equal amount of money out of its ass and be able to spend it all immediately, And the 350 million pounds per week very well could be, in the future, spent on the NHS if that's what the government were to decide to spend it on. So there could be that much of an increase, or it could be that they could maintain some of the subsidies that already exist. They could use a portion of it toward the NHS. They could use potential other money from other sources toward the NHS. Next issue, Scotland. 55% of Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom. Part of that is following the United Kingdom foreign policy, which includes relationships with other countries. They agreed to that. 55% of the Scottish people agreed to that, and the turnout was even higher than the turnout was nationwide for this referendum. As for Scotland, the turnout was lower than it was in England and Wales. So the Scottish people were less interested in the question of Europe, much less interested in the question of Europe than they were in the question of remaining a member of the United Kingdom. Reality has indicated so far that the European Union is not going to give Scotland favorable terms for joining as a separate country, and certainly they're not going to let them continue as a country within the European Union. You know, there might be a percentage of people that aren't even for remaining in Europe who are trying to use that as an argument. And I would also point out that in the 1970s, the SNP wanted to leave the European Union, and that's probably part of the reason why there are still some members of the SNP who believe in a fully independent Scotland from both Westminster and from Brussels. But honestly, at this point, if I lived in England or Wales, I would be perfectly fine with no longer having 53 members of the SNP and the other idiots from Scotland. Well, I don't want to say every member of Parliament from Scotland is an idiot, but that certainly is what their questions and concerns that have been raised in the media lately have made them look like. It sounded like every member of the SNP got up in Parliament and gave David Cameron the same line about, isn't it democracy if the majority of Scotland voted to remain? Isn't it democracy for them to remain? And no, because they, again, agreed as a majority to make decisions on foreign policy issues with the rest of the United Kingdom. So democracy is respecting both those wishes that were expressed in 2014 and respecting the new wishes of the electorate of the United Kingdom as a whole to leave the European Union. As for Northern Ireland, that's another situation where the nationalists are trying to cause trouble. The good thing about Northern Ireland is the nationalists have much less power there than they do in Scotland. You know, obviously in Scotland there is no Good Friday power sharing agreement that would limit the power of the SNP. You know, maybe there should be, but you know, that's one of the reasons I would just, you know, not care if Scotland went off and it did something at this point. It gets more public money per head than it deserves as it is through the Bartlett formula. It's not going to be able to maintain the spending it currently has, and it would have its own austerity if it were forced to go off on its own. And you know, maybe it deserves that, so it can see what it's really arguing for. Sorry, I for some reason I've been hitting stop on my videos, and in every other case, the other 5 videos that I did, all stop did was finalize the file, but lately it's been cutting off almost half of my files, and I've been having to re-record them. I guess I have to find a different program for doing this because it's really aggravating. So I'm sorry if I leave off a few things or repeat a few things. Anyway, I wanted to make a couple arguments and preempt a couple of responses about Northern Ireland and Scotland. There was a claim made that the EU was important in avoiding wars during the post-war period up until now. I don't accept that because of things like NATO. I don't accept that because the UK didn't even join the EU until 1973. They passed the act that allowed them to join in 1972. They had a referendum in 75. That was a significant period of time, and I don't think, even if they had stayed out, that they would have gone to war against any European country, or any European country would have gone to war against the UK. I don't think that's realistic. There's also the reality of NATO that helped avoid wars. There was the mutual threat of the Soviet Union. I could also go into the wars outside of its border that the EU prompted or helped to prompt. But anyway, the Good Friday Agreement, on the other hand, I do credit it for avoiding fighting taking place. Obviously, it's not a formal war. I mean, if you ask the IRA at the time, they thought it was a formal war, but I don't want to get into that. But as far as international law considers it, it was not. It was considered an internal conflict. And obviously, if you want to consider it an external conflict, then the EU did not avoid wars in Western Europe. And also, unlike the UK joining the EU, it was not a change to existing arrangements. It was continuation of the same arrangement that had been in place for, I believe it was over 70 years before the Good Friday Agreement was entered into, and the UK has only been a part of the European Union for 43 years. Just to preface my point that I believe the Good Friday Agreement has been instrumental in avoiding the terrorism and the hostility on both sides of the debate about remaining a part of the United Kingdom or rejoining Ireland. That kind of ended up being the reason it's worked is there was a lot given on both sides. Unionists aren't dictated to by Dublin, and the nationalists, to a greater extent, feel less dictated to by Westminster. And there's a power-sharing agreement between the nationalists and the unionists. But part of that agreement is that certain steps need to be taken by the government of Northern Ireland for a referendum to take place, and I certainly don't think Parliament would be inclined to depart from the Good Friday Agreement, and I'm not sure that the Republic of Ireland would want to do that either. The Republic of Ireland was also part of the negotiations with the Good Friday Agreement. Okay, so this is now going to be my third time talking about Scotland. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to that. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover with Northern Ireland. Long story short of that is I don't think the government, either the Westminster government or the Northern Ireland government, is going to any steps to reunify Ireland or to try to veto the process of leaving the European Union. So I'm going to return to talking about Scotland. Only about 1.66 million people in Scotland that voted to remain in the EU, and contrast that with over 2 million people that voted to remain in the United Kingdom. That's a large number of people that I believe would have to change their minds. It was the percentage of the vote in Scotland in this vote was 62 to 38. That's 24%, whereas the remaining part of the United Kingdom was only a 10% difference. but it was a difference of 0.4 million people. Something like 29% of the S&P didn't want to be in the European Union anyway, and that was actually a higher percentage than either the Liberal Democrat or Labor parties. And obviously with 85% of the vote almost that voted in the Scottish independence election. I couldn't find hard statistics on this. It's hard to find anything about the previous referendum. I was able to find one article that broke down the demographics, but it didn't reflect party membership. It talked about age and income and things like that, but I didn't see anything about party membership for the independence referendum. I would say that if there's a vote Scotland-wide, either for the Scottish Parliament or the Westminster Parliament, that gets anywhere close to 2 million votes for the SNP, even though a percentage of those might not even be in favor of leaving the United Kingdom, then I'd say that there was a good argument for a second referendum. Or even if the SNP were to get 55%, in a lower turnout election, it was actually 55.3% voted no on the last independence referendum. So if the S&P gets more than 55.3% on either the next Scottish Parliament election or the next UK Parliament election, then maybe you can make a strong enough argument that the support for independence has changed that much. But the polls don't indicate anything like this. That there's a large undecided segment. But at least a couple of the polls that have come out show the small lead for not having a new vote. But it's been like 43 to 41 and things like that. So there's no overwhelming consensus. Nothing that comes anywhere close to the percent of Scotland that voted to remain in the European Union because that makes or breaks the idea of remaining in the United Kingdom. That's just not borne out by any evidence, other than the fact that the SNP got about 50% of the vote in the parliamentary elections, but turnout was relatively low compared to the referendum and compared to the Westminster election. I also wanted to acknowledge that I realized the eligibility rules were different in Scotland. There could be a different number of total votes, and even if it 1.75 million, something like that, that would still be a difficult mark for them to reach. Or even the number that voted to remain in Europe, which is 1.66 million. The S&P hasn't been able to get that amount in anything so far. They got just over 1 million in the Scottish parliamentary vote. They got about 1.45 million in the last Westminster election, where they won 56 out of 59 seats. So, again, it doesn't show anything close to a reversal in feelings of the Scottish people toward independence from the United Kingdom. To get back to the youth vote, according to Sky data, their final referendum poll showed that only 36% of 18 to 24-year-olds, so that they voted, I believe it was 72 or 73% to stay in, but that only comes out to 26% of people in that age range. I also think that indicates that lowering the vote to 16, which I don't think should be done, that lowering the vote to 16 might not have made the difference. I also wanted to mention if there's anybody that questions the source of that data. I wasn't able to find a separate source of the same data, but the Financial Times, which has consistently argued against Brexit, showed that higher percentage of young people voted, with the exceptions of Oxford and Cambridge, and for the most part, the higher the percentage of young people who voted in a given area, the lower the overall turnout was. So that obviously shows that there's also a correlation between being young and staying home. When you look at 25 to 34-year-olds, there was only a 58% turnout, which obviously is better, but it's still lower than the 72% across the UK. And then 62% of those who voted to remain. So in total, only 36% of voters from ages 25 to 34 voted to remain. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the markets. People acted like the 2 days after the vote justified the potential decades that could have gone by with improvement in other areas. People talked about the markets, particularly FTSE as it's called. It's FTSE. It's just that's the way that they pronounce FTSE. At the lowest point, it wasn't even as low as it was on June 14th. So it really didn't deviate from the normal range at all. Right now, it's higher than it was 6 months ago as well. And then over the last year, it's down. So even if it does end up down slightly in the long term, it was on a long-term downward trend anyway. As for the pound against the dollar, that was at about 142 a couple weeks ago. The reason it fell so dramatically was there were a bunch of people that were betting for Remain, and if you know anything about the markets, people that want to bet in the short term will buy stock thinking it'll still go up. So it's not whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's the perception was that at least in the short term it would be a good thing to remain. So the anticipation was the vote would come out, and whatever the level was before the vote, it would increase at least slightly to give that person some money in the short term. So anyway, it only fell about 10 cents below what it was a couple of weeks ago. In total, it fell almost 20 cents because there was a big rush in bets in favor in the last day, because the polls that came out in the last day showed large remain lead. Some of them were even outside of the margin of error. So a majority of the 1 day reduction in the price was due to the last couple of days addition to the price. So it would have been a drop of less than half as much without the recent increase, and if they had seen a lead vote coming, it would have been a much more gradual drop. It might have just been 1 or 2 cents because they would have already anticipated it. And, a lot of times when there's a rally downward, it's increased. You can look at any chart with surrounding the 2008 crash. It had a very large short-term drop. Obviously, there needed to be somewhat of an overall drop, but the short-term drop was much more than any long-term drop was going to be. The drop might not have been to the same amount anyway if it were anticipated, rather than a sudden rush to sell that cascaded the price downward. So I know what the response to that is. Well, if you're saying it's such a small short-term drop and it would have been hardly any drop at all, why is it the lowest price since 1985? Well, if you look at the overall trend, it was at about 170 2 years ago when, there was no thought given about Brexit at that time. It was on a clear downward trend then. So it went from about 170 to about 155. That was before we even knew this vote was going to happen, which is what obviously we didn't know until the Conservatives won a majority, and we didn't know the exact timeline right away either. If you look at the 5-year trend, you can tell it's been a dramatic decline as well. Actually, in 2008, at one point, it was above 210. Obviously, it's been going down over a very long period of time, about 8 years or so. It's been going down. That's how you get to the lowest levels that you've had in 30 years. You have a consistent downward movement for 8 years. Then it doesn't take much for you to get to your 31-year low. The fall around the crash. Obviously, there was a crash in the United States too, so you can't just blame that because you're comparing it to another currency that's possessed by a country with with some of the same financial difficulties. So those are the main misunderstandings and points of confusion I wanted to cover, and it probably won't be until sometime next week, but hopefully things will settle down a little bit, and I can do a video where I just tell the basic story of the factors that took place that both delayed the referendum 41 years after the previous referendum, and that had to arise to make this vote happen.